Chapter 24. Mary wakes up from her nap as Warble is pulling into the Kenwood Inn bed and breakfast in St. Augustine. The oldest city in the United States, St. Augustine retains a heavy colonial flavor. There are Spanish-style buildings everywhere, and even a fort that was built by the French before being confiscated, first by the Spaniards, then taken from them by the British, and finally wrested from the Brits by the American revolutionaries. Architecture and history don't interest Warble, though, because he thinks he already knows all there is to know about both subjects. There are two things in St. Augustine that do interest Warble, though. Ponce de Leon's Fountain of Youth and the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum. Warble rises early the next day and goes off in search of the fountain. St. Augustine is not a very big town, and he had to park his vehicle a few blocks away from the bed and breakfast, in the opposite direction of the fountain and the museum. He walks the few blocks into town. After a couple of hours spent searching, Warble is no wiser as to the fountain's whereabouts as on the day he was born. "Darn that old Pancho the Lion fella," Warble says to himself as he scours the outskirts of St. Augustine for some sign of the French explorer's fountain. You'd think any self-respecting gentleman would leave behind some clear marks as to where his treasure was hid. After all, he's not the only one who wants to be young. Why be so selfish and hog the whole batch of juvenescent elixir for himself? After all, he's dead by now anyway. Why would he care if somebody else benefited from his bonanza too? What a short-sighted, greedy cad. Not to mention scamp, tramp, and scalawag he must have been. The frustration, heat, and humidity finally get the better of Warble. Dad blast that dad-burdened, metal-headed ignoramus. I've had it with him and his gall-derned cistern of vim and vigor. Who wants to quench their thirst at his stinking old water-hole anyway? Warble stomps off, trampling over some flower beds and absent-mindedly kicking a puppy out of the way as he makes his way back toward the main part of town. Warble enters the first store he comes to, a super speedy one-stop, like a cowboy from the olden days in the Wild West. He pushes both doors open, pretending they are the swinging doors of a saloon. "A Coke! A Coke! My kingdom for a Coke!" Warble sings out as the glass doors close behind him, hitting him in the butt. The clerk, who in Warble's eyes bears a striking resemblance to Wilfred Brimley, the crusty old geezer with the walrus mustache who was in The Stone Boy and that wholesome-as-all-get-out television show with Carl Malden, the guy from the streets of San Francisco, and who also happened to play the no-good, dirty-crossing lout of a so-called friend in One-Eyed Jacks with Marlon Brando. Looks at him with a deadpan expression and responds, "Coin of the realm is the only tender accepted here, young fella. No realms themselves." "That works for me," Warble wheezes, out of breath and dry of mouth from tramping through people's yards, looking for the Fountain of Youth. He grabs a decaffeinated Diet Light Cherry Coke and slams it down on the counter along with a $5 bill. While the Wilfred Brimley look-alike fellow makes change, Warble asks him for directions to Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum. Without looking up from the cash register, the clerk responds with a question of his own. "Have you tried looking across the street, young fella?" This guy even talks like Wilfred Brimley, Warble reflects. He masks his embarrassment by making a joke of his failure to observe the obvious. "Ha ha, I was just testing you, old fella." Warble takes his change without looking at it, as if he doesn't know how much he should be getting in return, and it matters to him not a whit. He fingers the coins of the realm in his pocket, though, as he's walking out the door to verify that it is indeed the correct amount. Warble can more or less tell from the size of the coins which denomination they are, not which religious affiliation they profess, but rather whether they are nickels, quarters, Susan B. Anthony, or Sacagawea dollars, etc. The change seems to be right, but Warble can't tell for sure, as the pennies and dimes are too alike in circumference and thickness for him to be completely confident. He doesn't trust the smoothness of the penny's edges, reasoning that they could be dimes worn thin through long and hard usage. Warble stops on the sidewalk and looks across the street at Mr. Ripley's Museum of Arcana. He tries to imitate the models in the J.C. Penney catalogs, staring into the distance, jaw jutted forward. He adds a Clint Eastwood squint. Finally, he pictures himself as a denim-clad youth, long hair blowing in the breeze, wearing a faded blue t-shirt under a flannel shirt, his thumbs in his pockets. Warble imagines he's in Winslow, Arizona, and is such a fine sight to see. But when a blonde in a flatbed Ford pulls up alongside him and makes eye contact, he practically jumps out of his skin and retreats back into the store. Do you have a payphone I can use, sir? What have you been smoking, young fella? There's a payphone right outside the door. The clerk fairly sputters, pointing a big stubby finger at a spot just outside the door. Ha, I got you again, didn't I, you old geezer? Warble says as he turns to walk out the door. What did you call me, young fella? A Wilfred Brimley-looking fellow wants to know, stepping out from behind the counter and wiping his hands on his apron. Mr. Geezer? Warble offers. Out! Get out with you, and don't bring your trade back here again. We don't want the likes of you in here. I guess that old fossil forgot to take his Geritol this morning, Warble mutters to himself as he heads out of the store and towards the payphone. What was that, young fella? The old clerk yells, stepping to the threshold in a more lively fashion than Warble would have given him credit for had he not witnessed it with his own 2 eyes. I said I wish that old gentleman top of the morning. Yeah, sure you did, a Wilfred Brimley look-alike says sarcastically, his fists seeming to grind themselves into his hips. His own hips, that is, not Warble's. He doesn't know exactly what Warble originally said, but he doubts the revised version bears much similarity to the original one. Out! Out! He points, glaring, and don't come back. The clerk shoots Warble a disdainful look, twitches his mustache, turns his back, returns to his throne behind the counter, and picks up the Florida Times-Union, snapping the pages as he makes a show of being deeply absorbed in some news report or other. Warble slinks into the phone booth, and while digging in his pocket for some change, furtively glances over at the street corner where he had been standing to make sure the blonde got the message and left.